Theo, the media told us that the Klamath Dam removals was going to be great for Northern California. It was going to, the whole area was just going to flourish. Okay, the dams are now gone. You're a journalist and a rancher. You live in Siskiyou County. What happened? Were they right?
Well, it was pretty much the opposite of what they told us was going to happen and what they told us did happen. When you Google search Klamath Dam removal, you'll see what a beautiful thing it has been. I am here to tell you that the people on the ground know the difference. It's not what the media, the mainstream media has cracked it up to be. It's actually been a major catastrophe. They've released somewhere between probably around 7 million cubic yards of sediment got released into the river. None of the sediment behind the dams was removed prior to breaching the dams. And so over the course of, in January 2024 is when it really started to flood into the river and either settle on the river bottom or be carried out to the ocean. We don't know how much settled. We can't really measure that without studies that nobody really wants to do. The powers that be don't necessarily want to go digging around and studying how much sediment they just released into the river, but it destroyed a lot of spawning grounds for fish, but maybe more importantly, it destroyed the food web in the whole at least 60 miles of river, because we know that the dissolved oxygen in the river hit zero twice since they breached the dams in January of 2024. And we have photo evidence of native species just found either floating dead on the surface of the water or on the banks of the river, or just trying to crawl, like crawdads, just trying to crawl out of this toxic sludge that was released. Because what was held behind those dams was sediment that was there's partially natural sediment. The headwaters of the Klamath River are actually naturally nutrient rich, has a lot of phosphorus originating in volcanic ground in Southern Oregon. So you're seeing naturally nutrient rich water, which isn't favorable for a species like salmon. And you're also seeing, a lot of agriculture in the upper Klamath Basin, and some of the runoff of the chemicals that are used for farming would naturally have made it in stream. And so those dams were a filter for some of those chemicals. And so that was what was trapped behind the dams. And of course now it's just unleashed into the main stem of the river. And we don't know how long it will take. The water is still murky. If you talk to the anglers on the river, they'll tell you that they don't have a fishing season because they can't see into the water to see any fish. So it's just been really a heartbreak for the people who live along the Klamath River.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely devastating. Tell me a little bit as we dive into this. And you wrote an incredible letter on this to Secretary Doug Burgum. He's the Secretary of the Interior, explaining what's happened from the ground, which again, we haven't heard much about at all. We really haven't heard from locals since these dams were removed. What's the aftermath been like? We're told occasionally in the media that it's been positive and fish are showing up in new places and all of this. But we haven't heard from a lot of locals, and what I have heard has been negative. So you wrote this letter revealing what's truly happened. You're kind enough to share that letter with me. I have it up on one today so folks can read it, see the photos you shared. Tell me a little bit as we dive into this letter and what you have uncovered about you and your background. You're a rancher and a journalist, correct?
Right. Yeah. I grew up right here in Scott Valley where I live today. It's the Scott River runs through the Scott Valley, and it's actually a tributary to the Klamath River. So I have this connection to the Klamath, even though I can't see the river from the Klamath River from here, and I don't get any water from the Klamath River, but I have that connection. And my family's been here I'm sixth generation here. My kids are seventh generation here. My husband's family is kind of the same story. We're both ranching families that have been here a long time, obviously, but we're not well-heeled at all. We're just kind of small. Our families have been able to hang on here in this area and have established deep roots, but also, we're not a big ag or cutting too fat of a hog or anything, but it's just a great community here. It's very rural. It's kind of the kind of place you'd want to live. A lot of hayfields and cows and good people that live here. So this is where I grew up. I went off to college and I ended up working in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. I had this idea that I wanted to pursue and promote private property rights. Ever since I was young, I had this impression that that was kind of critical to the success of our families and our communities and our nation. And so, and I think that I believe that even more strongly than ever now that I'm watching kind of what's happening to our rural community and our agriculture, just kind of breaking under the pressure of all the regulations that we're facing. So, yeah, after working in Washington, D.C. for the livestock industry for a few years, and I came home and continued writing because I'd made some connections with some ag publications while I was in DC. So I continued to do some freelance writing. I started my family, and my husband and I started increased on his little cow herd that he had, and we've been building, which has been really exciting, and have our 3 kids, and so now I'm just mostly doing that, but still just can't help myself when I see something like what just happened on the Klamath River. I feel very strongly that we have to, when we see a narrative that's being pushed that we know to be false because it's right in front of our eyes, what's true, it's incumbent upon us to speak the truth about it. And have I have the ability to write, so I feel like I should just, write it down and see who will print it.
Right.
So thank you for printing the letter. I really appreciate that.
My goodness, it's such an honor, and your reporting on this has won awards. You've been a major voice for this whole issue from Mendocino County. I always think if someone was just to be dropped in Mendocino County, they would have no clue they were in California, and even more so where you are in Siskiyou County. How would you describe Siskiyou County to someone who has never been there?
Well, Siskiyou County is a pretty large county in the state, but I think we have more cows than we have people. It's rural and very beautiful, mountainous. It's not, when tell them you're from Northern California, they think of San Francisco, the Bay Area, but that's like 6 hours away. So
Yes,
we're very,
exactly.
very different up here. Yeah. There's a lot of agriculture. There used to be a lot of logging, but that was fairly well shut down by endangered species regulations over the spotted owl in the 90s. So agriculture is now our mainstay. And Scott Valley is a little agricultural valley where we raise alfalfa hay and grass hay and some grain, and then cattle, beef cattle. We have a couple of small family dairies as well. And a lot of people are similar to my family, where they've been here a long time and have deep roots. And it's just it's the kind of place that you'd want to raise your kids. And that's why I came home.
It's a special
It's
place.
really
It's beautiful
it's
up
a
there.
special place. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the kind of place where we have 4 little towns in Scott Valley, ranging from 50 people to 700, I think. But our weddings and funerals have 500 people show up for those. So it's that kind of
Right.
a place. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that when you grow up in a small town, you have more community because you just know everybody. When you grow up in a city around thousands and thousands of people, your circle might be a lot smaller. It's the irony of living in a small town. Is it directly impacted by the dam removals? You said you're on a tributary.
Scott River is a tributary to the Klamath River. And we actually have a fairly sizable coho salmon population, which is listed as threatened under both the state and federal Endangered Species Acts. So our connection to the Klamath is one that, we have these salmon, also Chinook salmon, and steelhead also, that use our tributary, the Scott, for spawning and rearing. So we kind of, for decades, have had a microscope on us because of this, especially because of the endangered or the threatened status of the coho salmon. And so we have noticed for decades that because of this presence of this salmon and its listing, agriculture has been kind of taking the blame for that species struggling over several decades. But interestingly, in the Scott River watershed, the coho population has been on the increase for the last 20 years and increasingly so for the last 10 years. But overall, in the Klamath and up and down the Pacific coast, it hasn't been doing as well. So we have this connection to the Klamath where, there's fingers of blame being pointed at ranching and farming for doing harm to coho salmon, where there's actually a lot of factors that affect coho salmon. We can prove that we've been coexisting with coho salmon here in the Scott Valley for 20 years since they started counting them. But the truth is that I feel that there are entities out there that want to place blame on agriculture for ailments that may
The environmental issue.
yeah, maybe besetting the salmon or whatever species. And it kind of feels like the purpose is to get rid of small agriculture, independent producers. So I don't know if I answered your question about how we're connected to the Klamath, but
No, you did. And it's very true. Like, you look in the San Francisco Bay, I was just reading an article about the amount of sewage in the San Francisco Bay and how that's damaging salmon populations. But they're blaming us just a couple hours north because we have a dam that provides water to agricultural communities in the rural part of the state. We're the ones killing the salmon, not the sewage dump in the San Francisco Bay, which salmon have to. No, that couldn't possibly be it. It's our dam that's been there for 100+ years. Yeah.
Right.
So we're dealing with similar issues because the state is on a mission, it seems, to pull out dams, at least in rural and agricultural parts of the state. Dams that service urban areas seem fairly safe so far. When did you first start hearing rumors about the Klamath Dam removals? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I think it's been, I think I started writing about it about 10 years ago. So I know it was happening before 2014. It would have been maybe closer to 2009 or 2010. I'm not positive, but we used to kind of laugh about it. Like, they're not going to pull that off. That would be so crazy to do. Why would they do that? Because it's only going to do harm to fish. So, their hatchery records show that the salmon populations increased with the advent of the dams, which I wrote about in my letter to the Secretary of Interior. It's like, well, then, we just didn't think it could ever happen because it didn't make any sense to do it. But it made sense to somebody for some reason. We just don't know what that reason is necessarily.
When you read that letter, which everyone has to read this article, you break down very systematically that you all had warning. These officials knew exactly, or they should have known exactly what would happen if the dams were removed. There were whistleblowers. We'll kind of get into all this, but there were whistleblowers at DOI who said this would happen, and it was ignored. And it does raise a lot of questions about why. But so the main reason that the Klamath Dam removals were floated was it was predicated on saving salmon. Is that right? That was their main. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll get into this a little bit more, but just quickly overview, how are the salmon populations right now post dam removal?
Well, it's hard to tell for sure what's going to happen with the salmon, but we know so far that the Chinook fall run this past fall was half of what they expected it to be. We won't know. So there could be a few years of adults that will be coming back to their home spawning grounds. They spent time in the ocean for several years. They'll be coming back, and those cohorts will not show the damage yet. The damage, what we may see, is to the juveniles who try to leave spring 2025 and the winter of 2024, when these little baby coho and Chinook salmon were trying to leave their spawning grounds where they hatched and go to the ocean where they're supposed to grow into adults and then eventually come back in several years to spawn again. We won't know for a couple years how they survived, but we do know, based on studies of how juvenile salmon handle sediment loads in the water, that the sediment was anywhere from 4 to 30 times what juvenile salmon can survive during the time that they were trying to get to the Pacific Ocean. So it can't be good. And we know that there was a certain number of spawning grounds and juveniles that were living in the main stem Klamath itself that were definitely destroyed when the dams were breached. But, from my perspective on the Scott River, where we've been held accountable every time we have a dip in our salmon returns or our juveniles that go out to the ocean, if we have a dip in that number, we have blame placed on farming and ranching. Well, you must have used too much water or somehow harmed these fish. But now the terrible harm was done to them. They probably destroyed that entire generation of salmon when those poor little salmon tried to go into the Klamath to get to the ocean. When they left the beautiful, clean Scott River and entered the Klamath, they perished, no doubt. I mean, or they didn't do very well at all. So I'm just trying to get the word out and make sure that the authorities realize that this is why, when we don't have a good return in 2027, 2028, this is because of what you did with the dam removals. It is not because of something agriculture did. It's not something we could have ever dreamed of doing. We would have all gone to jail for putting that kind of sediment into the water. Talk to the logging industry around here. They can't drive a cat across a dry creek bed because of sediment that could eventually end up in a river. So it's just amazing that the agencies gave themselves permission to do this kind of a project without even trying, not even trying to get any sediment out from behind the dams before they blasted them. They were hoping that there would be enough flow. This is what they were saying. They were hoping that it would be a good water year where there'd be enough flow to just flush that sediment right out. Well, they didn't get that. So the locals are telling me along the river, along the Klamath, because I don't live right along the Klamath. The locals along the Klamath are saying, yeah, the bed of the river has raised because of the sediment. So, and if you think about the amount, so say, I think they estimated 7 million cubic yards of sediment was released from behind the dams. But I did a little thought experiment, like back before they did it. If 10 million cubic yards of sediment were released from behind the dams, which they estimated there was like 20 million cubic yards trapped behind the dams. So half of that, if 10 million were released, then that would be the equivalent of 6 lanes of freeway, 8 feet deep of sediment for 100 miles. That's how much sediment that is. So they admit they did 7 million. So I'm talking about, that's what 10 million would look like. So the river is only 250 miles long. So 6-lane freeway, 8 feet deep for 100 miles. And granted, some of that went out to the ocean because it stayed suspended in the water. But again, we don't know how much of that is now settled on the river bottom. Smothering the entire food web. So we have species that, we're not even hearing about because we know there's other endangered and threatened species that live in the Klamath watershed relied on that food web along the river. There was no care given to them. It was all this claim that it was for the salmon, even though this wasn't good for salmon, but that was the claim.
Right.
And there actually had to be special legislation passed I think there was special legislation passed in California so that they could do this harm to coho, the listed coho salmon, in order to carry out this project. Like they gave themselves permission to do this.
So they were acknowledging this was going to harm coho when they did it.
Yeah, interestingly, they did. Yeah. They said, short-term pain, long-term gain. But when you look at the reality of how this river is designed by God, it is warm and nutrient rich at the headwaters. And then as tributaries add clean cold water as the river heads towards the ocean, then it gets to be more decent habitat for salmon. But when they put those dams in up towards, higher up the river, that created a cold water source. So they could regulate the flows in the Klamath and keep a really good habitat for salmon year round. And so I was talking to, back before she passed away, Betty Hall, who is the historian for the Shasta Indian tribe. And she wrote a paper that she gave me about how the Klamath River, they used to call it the Stinking River before they put in the dams.
I have that written here. I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. Why did they call it that?
It's so low in the summer that it would just reek. You couldn't water your livestock, your horses there or anything. it was just not a steady flowing, beautiful, wild and scenic river, which is now designated as such, a wild and scenic river. But, without dams, it can't be that. It can't be that.
So you actually argue that the dams are better for salmon populations.
Yeah. Yep.
You talk about a whistleblower at DOI who was fired in 2011. He was told by a superior, the secretary, and this was Obama's DOI secretary, Ken Salazar, really wants to remove those dams. This is a quote. So you've made a poor decision in putting your disclosure forward. That's what he was told. And then he was fired. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened to Dr. Paul Hauser?
Yeah, that was it in a nutshell, but it's really interesting to go to the link that I linked to in this letter that I wrote, because you can watch him speaking in front of a pretty good crowd about his whole experience and what happened to him. But he made it very clear that, this press release came to him when they wanted to move forward with this dam removal. But he was the scientific integrity officer for the Bureau of Reclamation. And so he saw this press release and he had concerns that it really didn't seem to properly represent what he knew the scientific documentation showed were the risks of this dam removal and the downsides, possible downsides. Nothing is known until it happens, but the predicted scientific literature said that, it was going to have major impacts in a lot of different ways. So he brought that out to his superiors, and he was told numerous times not to email things that could be FOIA'd, Freedom of Information Act. He was reprimanded for sending emails to that effect. Obviously, he was forced out of his position because of his whistleblowing. And it was just, I don't know why that wasn't a bigger story when it happened, but that's there again. If the media is not there to cover, if a tree falls in the woods and the media is not there to cover it, then it didn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's not an ideologue. He's just a scientist. He's a hydrometeorologist at the Bureau of Reclamation. And he now lectures at George Mason. Brilliant guy, sounds like.
Yeah. So luckily he wasn't totally destroyed, which wouldn't have surprised me if they tried to totally destroy him, but that didn't happen. So, he still has a job and everything, but, he was trying to do something to help other scientists that work for the government feel like they could also come forward and tell the truth when they saw something happening that didn't comport with, science is science. So you can call it good or bad. It's just, it is what it is. But his concern was there was cherry picking of some of the science, and then certain things weren't being even considered in the decision-making process that should have been considered, like economic impacts and, the sediment and everything. So it's worth listening to him in his own words describe his experience, because it was just atrocious what happened to him. And I was so proud of him. I don't know him, but it makes you proud when you watch his interview and why he describes why he did what he did, even though it wasn't in his own best professional interest to do it and speak up. He did it anyway. And I thought it was amazing.
He's just doing his job, which is to be a scientist, and makes you wonder what kind of ideology was going on at these federal agencies that they didn't want to hear from the scientists, especially because he made the point that dam removal was not going to help the salmon unless they took all of these other steps. And it sounds like from your reporting, just DOI did not want to hear that. They didn't want to hear about other steps to protect salmon, which was his argument.
Right, and one of those points was, well, if the headwaters of the Klamath River is naturally warm and nutrient rich, then you have a problem there that's going to be really hard to remedy. How do you, because salmon don't like warm water and they don't.
That's kind of salmon 101. That's pretty basic. Me too. Not a hydrometeorologist.
More than I ever thought I would, but I knew that, 5 years ago. So yeah, just that was one of his points. There was also a point about parasites. There was this claim that dam removal would help with the parasite load, that there's a parasite in the Klamath that kills salmon. But it turns out they feed on that sediment that just got released into the river that's now living there forever. And so the parasite problem didn't go away, which was also predictable. He said salmon predation and disease would continue to be problems. Reductions in fall flows would be an issue after dam removal. And, water quality would obviously remain a problem if the river is naturally got water quality problems. So that was one among many things that he brought up that just didn't add up when they made this shining, glowing report of how great it was going to be when they pulled the dams out. And, it didn't work under the Obama administration, but, they bided their time and finally got it done under the Biden administration when all number of things happened under that administration that nobody ever dreamed would ever happen. Right?
Yeah, that's another thing about these agencies. They have a long time span. These ideas don't go away, and they can outlast an administration because there's very little accountability, so they can just hang out until a more favorable administration comes along and push their idea through. I mean, Dr. Hauser, from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like he was this anti-dam removal advocate. He was just explaining the real scientific repercussions on salmon populations if they did pull the dams and what needed to be done to mitigate those. And he was fired or forced out or whatever because of that.
There was actually a oversight hearing held by the U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources to talk about what happened with his wrongful firing by the DOI at the time. So yeah, that's another interesting video clip to go back and check out what happened in that hearing, because it was very well aired. What happened with that whistleblowing event is well documented, and yet it didn't seem to have any influence over what happened, and the whole thing went forward anyway. It's just amazing, what they were able to do.
But it's all about the salmon. It's all about the good of the salmon, the good of the ecosystem, just good science. And we're just the backward, old school, redneck communities that are behind the times and don't care about wildlife. That's the
and the common sense things that we knew would happen because we have common sense, but we're not scientists, so it didn't matter what we said. But the common sense logic didn't matter.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't have mattered if you were scientists, clearly, because they just had an outcome they wanted.
The wrong side of it then, or spoke the truth. You didn't have to take a side. Like you said, Paul Hauser didn't take a side. He was just trying to make sure that the agency was weighing all the different scientific literature that was out there. And what's interesting was that he said the decision was clearly already made before even some of the scientific work was done. And he made the point in his talk in, what was that, 2012, I believe, where he said, scientific documentation is often colored. This is my paraphrasing him, but it's often colored by who funded it and what their agenda is. So if the agenda was to take the dams out and it was funded by the Department of Interior to do certain, scientific environmental reviews, they've already made their mind. It wasn't like, let's do an objective approach to science on this project that we may or may not do. It was, we're going to do this, so crank out something that makes it look good, or ignore and silence anybody who wants to bring up the science that didn't look so good.
When people say, well, there's salmon in parts of the river we haven't seen in X number of years, that's one of the lines you'll hear about the success of Klamath Dam removal. Can you comment on that?
I can tell you that from talking to locals who live up in the area where they got these very, very impressive videos of fish, that very clean looking fish. Normally, by the time an adult got that high in the watershed trying to spawn and then die, they look really bad. They have sores. They look really rough. This was a very healthy, clean looking adult salmon that was spawning. It was interesting that they had the camera there right at that moment. And there was reports from locals that they were seeing, it looked like trap and haul vehicles that could have been planting fish. But, since we don't have, I can't prove that. And the official line from the wildlife agency is that No, the fish got there on their own. It was awesome. What a miracle. So yeah, it's kind of hard to believe. And what's sad is that after all the stuff we've been fed by the different agencies, people used to kind of trust the government, which is sort of funny, I guess. But you just, people didn't feel like they had a reason to question everything that came out from a government agency. And now nobody believes them when they say something. And, they just totally, if there was any trust in them before this, all this, now there's zero from locals, so it's not like it makes us feel better to see that there's an official press release that, yeah, those were real salmon that really swam up the whole river themselves and made their way into this newly opened up habitat. We just don't really buy it.
And why would you? And why should you? They've blown all your trust so far.
Yeah, this is the same agency that told us that the coho salmon in the Scott River watershed was going to go extinct after 2021 when it was a really dry year. And lo and behold, the fish actually had a really good year in our watershed that year. And we kept on having to tell them, you have to stop saying danger of extinction in the Scott River watershed because they are doing better than they were 20 years ago when you guys started counting them. And they finally stopped using that term for us. But it's the same agencies that they'll do that if you let them get away with it. But our little grassroots group, the Scott Valley Agriculture Water Alliance, we were pushing back on some of the narratives from the state. And that was one of them that they finally stopped saying specific to our little watershed. They couldn't say it anymore, that the coho were going to go extinct here. But they still say it on a bigger watershed level. So like for the Klamath watershed, they just use these words just to excite your emotions and make you feel this sense of urgency. Like, well, this whole species is going to go extinct. And it's just not true.
Alarmist language to kind
of
create an emergency. One of the things Dr. Hauser questioned was whether the Klamath was ever prime coho salmon habitat. He says they were introduced in 1895, and in your article you write that the Shasta Indian tribe agrees with that.
Right, and that is the local understanding, but it's one of those things that people just started saying, stop saying that because we lost that argument. You keep bringing that up, then you're just going to sound like crazy or something, I guess. But we know there's a local guy here who said his grandfather, I believe, was the one who first brought him here. So, and you can look back into historical documentation and see that that is the case. That the other thing that's interesting about the coho salmon is that we're at the very far southern portion of their range. So you can buy coho salmon in the store and eat them, right? But for us, they're a threatened species. But that's because they're abundant up in Alaska because the ocean temperature is such, I assume. I mean, that's one of the factors, ocean temperature. There's many factors, of course, that affect a population, but ocean temperatures is one of them. So we are not in the prime range for coho habitat. However, as you probably know, the Endangered Species Act was used as, I feel it's used as a blunt object all the time to attack industry and individuals trying to produce, for example, farmers and ranchers, because this endangered threatened species can come with a host of regulations that can then push producers off the land. But I digress. We were talking about coho habitat. Yeah. So us being not in prime coho habitat, the other thing is it's considered a coastal fish. And so like Scott River, where I live, I think we're 60 miles at least off the coast of river miles. So we're barely even what you would call coastal anymore. So it's a real shame that we have to deal with this threatened listing that has been a burden for our community for decades because, we've had to do things like put weirs on every irrigation diversion that we have in Scott Valley. We've had to fence cattle off of the streams because apparently, cattle walking in a stream is bad for fish, even though buffalo did, but, cattle can't. Logging had to make all sorts of changes. And like I said, logging has been shut down largely anyway because of spotted owl, but all these regulations so that they don't get any sediment into the water. So we have all these regulations on us, even though really, we're not in great coho habitat. It's asinine.
I don't think it's off topic at all to bring up the Endangered Species Act, because it's really concerning to look at how these bureaucrats and the government can come in and regulate people like yourself from so many different angles. I mean, there's a massive amount of control that they can assume over your life and your way of life and your land and what you do on your land and how you manage your business and your industry when you're a producer, all because of one animal that they say is endangered. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there's a lot of animals on that list that are not endangered anymore. They're not threatened anymore, but they continue to be listed. I mean, that's been an ongoing debate, in the Wyoming area over the grizzly bear, and in some of our other states that have grizzly bears. They shouldn't be on that list anymore, but they are. And, and it's always rural people who bear the brunt of that. So no, it's super relevant. This is what they used to remove the dams, was this whole story about salmon.
Yep, that's true. And then, speaking of other endangered species that they use as a weapon, here we have the wolf that was reintroduced, although I believe that the wolf that was reintroduced was not the native species of wolf that would have existed here. It was a Canadian timber wolf that was introduced here, much larger than what we would have had here. So we have that to deal with. That's in direct conflict with our livelihoods raising cattle. And then there is talk of introducing grizzly bears again. So we have a really tough road ahead of us. And so I'm afraid that this almost seems like an effort to remove independent small agriculture producers from the landscape. And I'll tell you, here in my little valley where, there's been these families hanging on here for generations, but there are ranches that have been coming up for sale, and the only ones who can afford to buy them are groups like the Nature Conservancy or other nonprofits that also happen to get billions of dollars in grants from the federal government every year. Maybe not now after Doge, but these outfits that can afford to buy a ranch, and the rest of us, there's just no way, there's no way we can do it. So,
I was just talking about this with someone. These NGOs coming in, these government NGO partnerships, they're so concerning, because this is the future of agriculture in the U.S. This is the future of small independent production in the United States. You cannot compete with these deep-pocketed, all-powerful agencies. They have so much money. The Nature Conservancy has so much money. I think they're the largest landowner in the U.S., if I'm not mistaken. And what are they hoarding all this land for? It's not public land that you can hunt on and access. I think we all can appreciate public land in the West. It doesn't belong to us, the people. It belongs to these unaccountable but extremely powerful NGOs who hoard the land and then keep us out of it. I'm really concerned about that, especially given the amount of grant money that they get. I mean, they're buying our land with our money and keeping us off of it. You talk about American Rivers, which had a huge role. They're another NGO. They had a huge role in the Klamath Dam removals. Can you tell me about that? What was their involvement?
I'm not 100% sure. It's hard to know who the big players are at the high levels because we're kept out. We're kept in the dark. We don't know. We just wait till the authorities tell us what's going to happen to us. But we know that they were pushing really hard for dam removal, and they're doing that. I believe it's a nationwide effort, right? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't know if they're involved in the Mendo ones. There's other NGOs there, but it just shocks me. I was interviewing a tribal leader up in Lake County who was telling me how an NGO, Caltrout, kept him and his community out of discussions about the dam single-handedly. They were given a seat at the table to potentially assume control of the dam. Of course, they don't want that. They want the dam gone. And they kept Lake County, these, citizens, United States citizens who own these, lands. This is the dam is owned by a private company, but it's in the middle of the Mendocino National Forest. It kept them out of that discussion. So, just the amount of power these NGOs have is so suspicious to me that they constantly show up as decision makers, canceling out voices of citizens. It seems like that's kind of what happened with you guys too.
Well, Exactly. In 2010, there was a ballot initiative that where 79% of our voters in Siskiyou County voted against dam removal. But it didn't matter. That didn't matter. Our voices here down locally on the ground didn't matter. So, and our board of supervisors opposed it, obviously. Our federal representative, our congressman, Doug LaMalfa, opposed it for years and still does, but, well, too late now. But I do hope that there's some way where the current administration can come and at least do an investigation of the spending and the environmental harms done. And by the way, I also haven't talked about, I jumped straight into environmental harms, but there's a lot of people that were harmed by this too. And I don't want to gloss over that because um,
We always
the
do,
environment,
right? We go straight to and it's
right,
just the way that the media likes to talk about it. But human
right.
beings we're
They
part of
talk about,
nature. You're
yeah,
you're feeding your
exactly.
kids.
Yeah,
You're a community. You're an American town. If one American small town doesn't
right.
matter, what matters? What are we fighting for here? It's people's
Yeah.
livelihoods. You feed the country. You feed Sacramento, San Francisco, LA. Of
Mhm.
course you matter. And of course, you list at the end of your article, you have a whole list of ways that people have been hurt, not just agriculture, but just citizens who
Right.
live there.
That's what I wanted to add was that, this beautiful little community that used to be along the shores of Copco Reservoir, Copco Lake. They've just been, I was just talking to a lady who's lived there for a long time. Her dad, I think it was her dad who um, bought property there and it was his dream. And she said that the whole community is just destroyed. They're just trying to heal now. But there's homes that are because of the loss of the pressure that was provided by the water in the lake. There's homes that are now um, crumbling. Their infrastructure just isn't sound any longer. The roads are also caving in along there because of the loss of that water pressure. Wells are going dry. Um, there's there's homes up and down the Klamath River that are now in a new floodplain because the even though the advocates for dam removal claimed that well those dams were not for flood control, well they did do flood control and they seriously abetted the surges of water that can come down. They delayed it and lessened it. And so now we have this new floodplain, and we also have this danger that so apparently in the restoration work that's happening in the footprint of the dam, they're putting in these huge dead trees, like root wads and dead trees, that next time the locals are afraid next time there's a high water event, because this happened earlier this past winter where we had a lot of water. One of the trees almost took out a bridge on the Klamath River. So they're afraid that we're going to have more log jams. These trees are just going to get washed down and have log jams and do some serious harm and possibly threaten lives with these kinds of, huge log jams that build up. And there's some narrow canyons in the Klamath River that those log jams backing up, causing a huge amount of water to build up, and then a sudden burst of water when it breaks apart. It could kill people, not to mention ruin homes. And there was a mitigation fund that was set up during this dam removal process that has just been a total black box. Nobody really got any mitigation funds from it that I've known. And the county hasn't gotten any information from the people who run that mitigation fund on where the money went, how it was spent, and what will happen to it if they didn't spend it all on residents who are affected, where is that money going to go? We don't know the answer to that. So there's
Wow.
some kind of shady things going on. The state also won't report on how much money they've spent so far on the whole
Yeah.
effort. The rumor is it's gone way over budget already, but they won't disclose that. So that seems odd. Like
Yeah.
we should know that, right?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's our taxpayer dollars. This is not paid for by this was paid for by taxpayers and ratepayers. They took the dams out. They paid to take the dams out. 79% voted no. They were still forced to pay to destroy their own dams, your own dams.
Yeah, we were paying, there was a little surcharge on our power bill every month that we were paying to help fund dam removal. Plus, the states of California and Oregon promised, committed more money to the effort, especially California. I'm not clear on Oregon, but California, I know, added, because the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said, you guys don't have enough money for the liability of removing these dams. So California stepped up and said, hey, we'll foot the bill. So there again, I'm a taxpayer in California. I'm helping foot the bill.
Yeah. And California voters in 2014 voted to dedicate a lot more money to building more water storage, more water infrastructure, given that our state desperately, desperately needs it. I just read a quote by Edward Ring, who's really brilliant, writes a lot about these types of issues. I'm not going to be able to quote it verbatim, but he said, everywhere else in the West, drought is a factor of just the environment and the nature of the West. In California, it's a political choice. We do not have to be a state that deals with drought. We could develop millions more acre feet of water in the state. We just choose not to. It's totally a political choice. Going back to American Rivers, this NGO, in March of last year, after pushing for these dam removals, they published an article on their website on the Klamath Dam removal alone is not enough. So you guys actually haven't done enough yet, Theo. You need to do more.
No, that's right. Yeah. So, and that what they were getting at in that article was that now we need to be regulating agriculture in the tributaries to the Klamath, like Scott River and Shasta River, which is where that's the majority of our agriculture on the lower Klamath, is those two valleys. So their point was, you guys are obviously using too much water. So now that the dams are out, you guys also need to stop irrigating so that your tributary rivers will give more water to the Klamath, which, it's true that now that they took the dams out, they're going to be sorely lacking in water come, August, September, October, until the fall rains come. So I am really worried that and in fact, it's already happening. So on a seemingly unrelated note, the Scott and Shasta valleys have been under this emergency drought regulation since 2022, where the state has been cutting our irrigation water by, in my valley, 30%, which is very hard to survive. And they said it was because of this super drought that we were in. We were in a real bad drought a couple years ago.
Since what, 2023, right?
Yeah. All of 2023, we haven't been in any kind of drought
yet. And they haven't lifted that.
Yet the governor's drought order remains in place, and the state water board keeps on putting this emergency regulation on us. So here we're struggling, trying to survive on 70% of our normal irrigation water. They even told us that we had to limit how much our cows were allowed to drink under this emergency regulation. Really inhumane, awful stuff.
The real animal rights people here showing up.
Yeah. So, and they're now pursuing a permanent in-stream flow regulation to replace, because I think they're realizing that they look pretty ridiculous because we're not in a drought, but they're still pretending like we are, and they're doing these emergency regulations on us that we're trying to survive right now, while they cook up a permanent in-stream flow regulation. So that means in the Scott River, for example, if they set a number like they want 50 cubic feet per second running in the river in July, and if it's not, they'd be just shutting down irrigation pumps. Groundwater. I'm not talking about just surface water, groundwater too, which is historically beyond the reach of the state water board to go after groundwater like that. But using this emergency thing, they've got their foot in the door, and now they're trying to do a permanent regulation along the same lines. As far as I can tell, we don't know what they have up their sleeve for the permanent one, but they've announced that they're going after a permanent regulation on the Scott and Shasta. So, American River's calling for more regulation. It's already happening. So, whether, what came first, did American Rivers push for it and then it started to happen, or, was it already
Is it a concerted effort by all of these people that share the same ideology?
Yeah, so we have just layers of regulations happening for us. You probably already know about the Sigma groundwater conservation.
Talk about that a little bit. Tell me about that.
Well, in 2014 there was a law passed, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We call it SIGMA, and a lot of basins up and down the state of California had to get these groundwater sustainability plans in place, and local governments oftentimes were in charge of building those plans, getting them approved by the state, and then implementing those plans. Well, we did that, and our local county put a plan in place for us, and then like as soon as that plan was in place, the state water board bulldozed it and just started doing these emergency regulations, these emergency drought regulations. However, it's still required that we have that plan in place. So we have this groundwater sustainability plan in place, even though it's kind of irrelevant because we're getting this other set of regulations put on us that reduces our water by 30%. But in the meantime, our poor little old county that's totally broke has to find a way to pay for this groundwater sustainability plan. So now they're talking about fees for water use or some other way to pay for implementation of the plan that's required by the state that we have it, right? So now we're talking about like $8.50 per acre foot of water that you use or something, that was proposed, $8.33 per acre foot. So that's going to be on top of also having our water cut off by 30%. And so now we have to pay for what water we do use, thousands of dollars. It's going to be crippling. And then we have another layer, the Clean Water Act, total maximum daily load, the TMDL thing. We have that going on too. And apparently they're talking about a new fee for that'll be tacked on. So it just feels like they're trying to smother us out. It really does.
Yeah. And notice these tools that they use. I mean, it's so systematic. They use an Endangered Species Act in some listed animal. They use an emergency declaration that never gets lifted. All of these extenuating circumstances that allow them to come in and take more power over your life. It's important to notice that pattern because it's pretty consistent. And you wrote in this letter, one of your main points to Doug Burgum that you highlight is along these lines that you're concerned agriculture will be blamed for the damage done by the dam removal. You can see that coming. You can already see that lining up with the way that American Rivers is talking. Can you talk to me a little bit about, these water cuts that have historically been happening at least since 2022? Is there any data showing that they have helped fish populations? Is there any actual proof that cutting water has helped?
No, that's the other problem. You would think the state would take an action, such a drastic action as cutting our water by 30%, which is how we make our livelihood. So it's almost directly correlated to what we're able to produce. So, and profit and stay afloat as farmers and ranchers. You would think that they would follow a regulation like that with an analysis of whether it was even effective. And they did not, because they didn't have to. So they just kept it in place, and there has been no noticeable change in the Scott River because of these cuts. They claim, some of them anecdotally, well, it reconnected faster, or it, bounced back faster when the weather changed in October, November. But did it make a difference to fish? And they can't say yes to that. They can't say yes to that because we still have to wait. We don't have any dams on the Scott River. It's a free flowing river. We get snow melt from the mountains, and the groundwater in our little basin also feeds it from, the aquifer. So we have base flow feeding it from the aquifer, and we have the rest just has to come from snow melt. And we don't have an overdrafted aquifer. We have a healthy aquifer. So the claim is that farmers irrigating less would help fish. But what we've witnessed for the last several falls is just like every other year when we're waiting for the fall flush. We're waiting for fall rains to come so that the adult salmon can return to their spawning grounds to spawn in our river and upper tributaries up here in the mountains, in the little creeks. And nothing has changed about that. We still have to wait for that fall flush. So it's just been a lot of pain for no gain, for no actual gain that we can see visibly.
What do you mean fall flush? Sorry, is that like the rainy season?
Yeah, the rainy season, the wet season, and also when the weather turns and the leaves start, falling, the trees and vegetation aren't taking up as much water. So that helps you know, add to water in the river and the streams. But also what you really need is the fall rain in order for, because the fish are waiting, they're waiting for that cue for a fall flush is what we call it. They know with their sensitive noses, they know when it's time, because they get that sense that, okay, there's been a flush of water that has made it down, and now it's safe for us to go up into our tributaries and spawn. Because if it's not, if there isn't enough sufficient water with a big flush like that, then they could start migrating up too early and get trapped, in the waters will be too low, and they would die, or they're going to die anyway because they spawn and then they die, but their eggs might also die if they came in too soon. So they have to wait for that fall rain.
Yeah.
And
And that's a
that's up to Mother Nature. And we've seen that it's been, in recent years, that fall flush has come a little bit later. It's been like mid-November to even late November. And what's hard is the coho salmon are okay with that because they have a pretty big migration window, but the Chinook salmon, they have a smaller migration window. So they struggle more if the fall flush comes kind of late, they have a harder time. They don't have as big of a window to spawn. So, they're commercially fished. And so, the commercial fishermen and tribes that want to fish Chinook salmon, they obviously don't like that. If we have a small, narrow window for those Chinook to spawn, it has a bad effect on their populations. But unfortunately, they've been pointing the finger at us as though agriculture is the reason for that.
which
But
is
it
totally
really,
illogical. You can't control the rain,
right, right.
and then that your groundwater and irrigation water doesn't have anything to do with the salmon spawning patterns. It sounds like.
No, it
Wow.
doesn't. As far as I mean, they
Yeah.
haven't proven that it does. You'd
Right.
think they'd need to prove that, and before they just started destroying people's livelihoods.
Right. And that's what I was gonna ask you. I mean, do they have, that you'd think if they really believed this was going to save salmon, this was going to be so good for the ecosystem up there, they would be anxiously, setting up all of these studies to prove that they were right so they can go replicate this. Are you seeing a lot of monitoring? Do you see a lot of reporting of salmon runs and salmon numbers and that kind of thing? Because I feel like when I try to figure that out for the Eel River where we are, it's like very scarce information about fish runs. And you'd think
Mhm.
that they would be interested in getting that data out there if they truly believe this is good for salmon
Yeah.
populations.
It's surprisingly hard, even before dam removal, it was really surprisingly hard to find salmon counts and then
Yeah.
find accurate ones, because sometimes things would get reported when it was raw data being used that needed to be adapted. What I'm trying to say is that California Department of Fish and Wildlife hasn't done a very good job of getting their salmon counts out to the public in general. And so it's not too surprising to me that we don't all know what's going on with salmon counts right now, and that you really have to hunt it down. And I have to admit that I haven't been hunting that down in recent days. So
I guess that's kind of my point is like, you shouldn't have to hunt it down. If they really believed in this and their job is to monitor fish and they care about that more than anything, including your livelihood, you'd think that they would be really focused on making sure that information was out there. But I keep thinking about you saying that they had to pass a special permissions to go through with the dam removals because they knew it was going to cause harm to coho salmon. Doesn't seem like they maybe really want the data. You quote a fishing guide who said he doesn't have a business right now. He said there's no place for salmon to spawn. Is that what a lot of
yeah,
the anglers up there are saying, guides?
yeah, yeah. And I have family who have a really terrifying little fishing boat. They go out on the ocean, and they said that the ocean fishing is bad too,
Really?
along the coast. Yeah. So I know it's affected, aquatic life all the way out into the ocean, but who's going to study that?
Right.
Is all we can get is anecdotal evidence, which I mean, that's what I'm hoping, that the current administration will take an interest and start to study this. How is life doing in the ocean after this travesty? How is life doing in the Klamath? It is a navigable water. You would think they'd have an interest there.
Totally. Yeah, and especially with the efforts across the whole West to pull these dams, maybe we study the one that we did and see what's happening, but there's not a lot of
See how
interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a ton of interest in that, it seems. You said also that same fishing guide, well, you quote a resident living at River Mile 180 who said there's no life in the river. And then you quote
Yeah.
this guide who said they pulled the bottom of Iron Gate at the, quote, worst time for salmon. So the way you described in this article, it seems that a lot of the decisions made, if they were done for fish, they were done very recklessly and unscientifically. And they,
Right.
in a way that was almost the worst possible method if you wanted to save fish populations. Can you talk a little bit about that? Some of the decisions they made that hurt fish?
Yeah. Yeah. So when they finally breached the last lowest dam, Iron Gate, and let all the gush of sediment into the river for the first time in January 2024, that would be right at the beginning of where a bunch of juvenile would salmon would have been trying to begin to make their way down into the Klamath River, out of the tributaries into the Klamath River to make it to the ocean. So that was a really bad time for juvenile salmon. With that kind of terrible turbidity in the water, suspended sediment in the water, that's where we estimated, I was looking at a salmon study from University of Washington that was talking about, at what levels of sediment do juvenile salmon start to get stressed or die. And we were well within the very, very stressful, if not lethal levels for months into into the early spring. And then again in August, they started tearing out the remainder of that dam, the Iron Gate Dam. And again in September, there was another a big flush. And so it was, again, here we're at a very bad time for adult fish who are trying to come back in
Right.
to the Klamath to begin their journey up, where they will eventually spawn in their native grounds, die. They spawn, they die, and that's part of their life cycle. So they were going to die anyway, but they needed to spawn first.
Right.
And
Right.
and we don't even know, with the amount of sediment that got sent down that river, you know, how hard was it for a lot of those fish to even get into their tributaries, like where my river, the Scott, meets the Klamath? How bad is the entrance to that tributary now? It's just the landscape has totally changed. And they talk about, now fish can spawn higher up above the dams, which I hope that's true and I hope that's great and everything. But these fish are wired to go to their natal spawning grounds. So for one thing, it would take time for them to start going up, into the upper reaches of the Klamath. But also, there were historically some barriers, natural barriers in the river that would have kept those salmon from going up very much higher than the dams anyway. So it just seems like the whole thing was based on false premises.
Hmm.
If that was never historic salmon ground above those natural volcanic reefs in the first place, where the dams are now located or were located. What I heard was that those natural reefs were blasted when they blasted the dams. I don't know exactly what happened there, but I'm assuming they did clear them out so that fish can go up where they never have gone before.
Okay, interesting. So they cleared out the natural barrier. When I hear you say that there was multiple, demolition phases in 2024, I guess maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, but that sounds like a rush before maybe a new DOI. Is that maybe something
That's what
that
it
played a
felt like.
factor?
I think that's what it felt like to a lot of people. Like, well, now we got to get this done because they're gonna, the new administration, that everything, the political environment was perfect for this dam removal to happen when it did, but it was a window that was getting quickly narrowing. So I think that is part of it. You can't prove that, but
Right, right. Well, I mean, you can pretty sure it wasn't for the good of the fish. The timing wasn't built around, when is
right,
best for the fish.
exactly.
Speaking of political opportunism, Gavin Newsom has bragged about taking out your dams. He's made that a highlight of his administration. He was on video, I think last year, talking about highlights of the year. First one he listed was taking out these dams, restoring the free-flowing river. He's pushed for more dam removals. He's excited about the dam removals in Mendocino, where I live, that provide water to 600,000 people. Has he followed up with you guys? He was there with a shovel looking, in his mud boots or whatever. Has he been back? Does he seem to care that his decision is destroying your ecosystem and your community?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of, but I don't think he would call me if he were in town.
He wouldn't be high on his list. That's a good thing.
Really
Take it
sad.
as a compliment.
Really sad that he's using that he calls that a big win. It's just really sad because it has been such a disaster. And I mean, I don't know if he spent enough time here, if he could realize what actually happened, or if he's just reading the same media stories that you and I find when we Google it, But I think at this point, if he did know how bad it was, he would know that he needed to either redirect attention or I don't know how he would deal, how he should deal with this politically, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope it comes up. I hope if he tries to run for president, rural America hears from rural California. The media depicted this as having a lot of tribal buy-in. Is that true from your perspective?
Well, there was tribal buy-in from several tribes. However, there is one tribe that is not federally recognized, the Shasta Indian tribe, that was not in favor of it. And this is actually the dams, the majority of the ground we're talking about was their ancestral grounds, or is their ancestral grounds. But them not being federally recognized kind of negates, and they didn't have a voice. And so somehow there were other tribes who felt that this was going to benefit them. And I kind of feel, may have been misled into believing that this was going to be a silver bullet for their communities and their fishery. And I think that it was a big, big mistake for them to get behind this. So, I've talked to some of them, and, one leader I know of said, yeah, he's in big trouble with some of the grandmas around, his, but that hasn't changed their public stance. And I think they're still trying to call it a win. And, we're all hoping that someday it can heal. And nature can heal itself incredibly well. We know that nature is resilient, despite what, the environmentalists want us to believe. But this was a really big thing to heal from. And it's going to take probably longer than my lifetime to see that happen. So that's sad.
It must have been hard to watch this coming since 2009. First, to believe it could never happen, and then to just watch it become reality. Especially you have kids who probably you would love to see stay there if they want to. Seventh generation in your family. When you kind of look at the future and just what you've been through since these dam removals were floated, is that painful? Does it feel like kind of pointless, all that you've been through and your community's been through?
Well, it is pretty frustrating when we all saw it coming. Painful, yes. But I think for me, the people who live right along the Klamath River, it's been the most painful for them. For me, I see it as a looming threat because I know exactly what's going to happen. I've seen the writing on the wall, but it hasn't hit yet. This idea that, well, they've set us up for decades where agriculture is to blame for whatever ailments, the fish might be having. And so even if they pulled out the dams and caused this awful thing to happen to the salmon populations, they're going to refocus the blame on agriculture. It's going to happen. I'm here to tell you, write this down. What is it? May 25th, 2025. It's going to happen. So the pain hasn't all the way settled in for us in our community yet. And I'm hoping that, if we do enough to fight back against the narrative, that we might be able to prevent that from happening. That's my hope, because they've already destroyed the river, the Klamath River. They've destroyed several generations probably of salmon, but they haven't destroyed agriculture yet. And I'm just hoping it's not too late, that we can salvage agriculture from taking the fall for what's just happened. But I can see the effort to blame agriculture, try to get us to stop using any water at all, get us removed from the land. Maybe NGOs or tribes or whoever take over the old ranches and farms that used to be our little families and family farms, and kind of rewild things around here, get the humans off because humans are evil. And maybe, the hope is that it'll just be a better place without us here. And I just hope that vision that someone has for this area doesn't come to fruition.
You think this was always the plan for them long term?
It seems like it's been a pretty long-term goal. Yeah, because agriculture around here, we are very accustomed to the Endangered Species Act and, regulations putting major pressure on our ability to move forward and stay in business. And then, things like when they bring a wolf, and this wolf is just destroying our calves that we are here to protect, it's so demoralizing. So there's a psychological aspect to this too. Not only are you're trying to keep your business in the black, but your mental state, when you see things happening, when you're forced to do, this, for example, under the emergency drought regulations that are fake, you're forced to put this whole plan together and make a spreadsheet and report weekly and, put in a well meter and that you can't even afford to do, or it's not even feasible. All these little things that you're supposed to now do that kind of just takes the joy, sucks it right out of the way of life. Why we do this, we don't do this way of life because we love spreadsheets and compliance. You know what I mean?
Right.
And when you have wolves coming around and maiming your livestock, not killing them, just, chewing their rear end out and leaving them, not eating them, just, it's so demoralizing and heartbreaking and that's the psychological part that I feel is almost purposeful as well. Like, just make it too miserable to want to do this anymore and get rid of these independent small producers that I just feel like we have a moral obligation though to hold on, because if small agriculture in America doesn't hold on, who's going to control your food supply? Who's going to be in charge of you? If you can't go to a grocery store and buy something that was grown by a competitive market of farmers, do you trust large corporations to take over my little farm, or foreign countries to supply your food? There's no better way to lose our independence than to clean out our little independent producers. So it does feels like there could be people who think they're going to benefit from this systematic removal of small farmers and ranchers.
For some, it's probably grievance. For some, it's probably greed. I think a lot of people, it's just ignorance. They just believe it because they read it and they were told whatever by the media. But in the macro, when you zoom out, you cannot be free without the ability to have property rights, that's why the government exists, to protect your property rights. That's really the only reason we all agree to live in this system. Without that, without the ability to grow your own food, without the ability to create opportunity for yourself and live the way you want, you don't have a free country anymore. You just don't. And all of these actions and all of these little, death by 1,000 cuts, they're always directed to small producers. You're the guys getting the water cuts. You're the ones with wolves, sicked on your herd. You're the ones who have to deal with environmental regulation, overregulation that you can't sustain. A massive corporation, they can sustain regulation like that. They can survive. And this has happened over and over again. It destroyed the American hog industry. When you have tons and tons of regulation, you get Chinese owned Smithfield. They're able to deal with that. You get JBS, which is a Brazilian owned meat packer whose owners have been convicted of bribing federal officials. They can survive in this market, but your family can't. You guys are honest. You're honest brokers raising your kids and producing a quality product on American soil. You can't survive that. No one can survive that. So this matters to everyone. You don't have to have a ranch. You don't have to live on a river. You don't have to be a fisherman. You don't have to be a rancher. This matters to all of us. And I think that's, people need to understand what's at stake when the government attacks small producers like you guys. So for this dam removal, for us in Mendocino, the dam removal will just destroy a lot of agriculture. We won't have any more hay because it just will cut our water supply. There won't be water, especially where I grew up in Potter Valley and in Lake County, where that tribal leader, E.J. Crandall, represents constituents. Those people will just totally suffer. They won't have, there won't be agriculture the way it is now. For you guys, it seems that this specific dam removal caused a ton of damage, but without more awareness, the worst is yet to come for agriculture, because you'll be the scapegoat for the damage they did by taking out these dams and the harm they caused salmon. Do I have that right?
Right. And I haven't really talked about the agriculture in the upper Klamath Basin, in the Klamath Project up there, where the upper Klamath Lake was dammed in order to increase the water level in that lake, and the whatever water was added to that lake was meant for the farmers who were, I think they were World War II vets who were told to come out, and they were given land out there, and they started farming out there with that water that was built up in that lake. Now, if that dam gets removed, that ground all dries up. And we already know that for years, the Bureau of Reclamation has been sending a lot of that water down the Klamath River in the name of saving salmon. So they already have this battle going up there. And so that's a huge amount of agriculture in the upper Klamath that stands to lose. And now now with the lower dams gone, they can have this threatened species, coho, that could feasibly make it up to them. And now they have a new ESA species in their backyard. So that agriculture community is in big trouble too.
Is this the Link River and Keno dams that you write about? Those are those dams that they're threatening to pull?
Wow. There's calls. Yeah, there's already calls to pull those remaining dams out. And, it's true. You can't call the Klamath a free-flowing river yet. It's not. There's still dams at the head of it. And once those are gone, they really won't have any, water stored up for late season in the Klamath. It will be the stinking river. So my hope is that with those dams still there, the river can keep at least some of its flow going year round. But without those there, that'll be gone. So, the hope is that they stay, but I won't be surprised at all if they go.
So to really highlight this, I'm going to read a section that you wrote in this article that, again, is truly a must read. And I hope Doug Burgum is reading it and everyone you sent this to. But they're going to blame agriculture for this. So you describe, we were told that removing any sediment from behind the dams was, quote, too expensive, and that, quote, flushing it was the only viable option. By KRRC's own estimate, 5 to 7 million cubic yards of that sediment was released into the Klamath River during initial drawdown. For several months, suspended sediment levels in the river varied from 2,000 to 16,000 milligrams per liter over a stretch of at least 60 miles, levels that are approximately 4 to 30 times what juvenile salmon can survive. Dissolved oxygen hit zero twice. Millions of native species were killed in and along the river. The entire food web has been destroyed. Wildlife were bogging down and dying in the footprints of the reservoirs as well. Locals were shocked and dismayed. Many began calling the river, which reeked of dead animals and toxic sludge, the river of death. This is what happened after they removed the dams. This had nothing to do with agriculture, and people need to remember that when they come after you guys in the near future.
Thank you for putting that on the record. Yes.
Yeah, that's horrifying. I mean, they smothered the river. Fish can't live in conditions like that. I was pulling up a study. I don't know if this is a study you're familiar with, probably is, but this came out last year, and I noted it at the time. It said it was a study by Reviews in Fisheries Science that showed that the sediment levels from the Klamath Dams were, the survival odds for Chinook salmon eggs decreased by almost 17% and 18% for coho salmon for every 1% increase in fine sediment. So just eggs can't survive a choked out river like that.
I hadn't seen that, but
it makes sense. I mean, it's almost just obvious and logical, as they acknowledged when they got special permission to wipe out coho salmon to save them.
They did away with all kinds of mining, and like I said, logging has been highly restricted and regulated in the Klamath watershed, because any small amount of sediment was just not acceptable, because fish, so either, which we all knew at the time, that amount of sediment that we were talking about with, small mining claims and a little bit of logging here and there wasn't going to hurt any fish or do very little harm. We all knew that. And it was disgusting to us that they were shutting down entire industries because of these regulations. But this just added insult to injury when they unleashed an ungodly amount that we would never even imagine or be capable of unleashing that much sediment. And it was okay because it was the government doing it. And NGOs that have American Rivers as their title, so they're so great because they say they're for protecting fish and wildlife. But what I keep coming back to is, even if you were a person who agreed that it was cool to destroy people's livelihoods and homes because it was going to save a bunch of fish, even if you were in that camp, you need to know that they didn't save fish. They just destroyed a bunch of fish and their habitat for decades to come. That's what you need to know, even if you're okay with what happened to the people in this watershed, And that's what's not being told. There is no interest from the mainstream media in that narrative, the real narrative, which isn't shocking at all. We were used to that, But luckily in this day and age, we have people such as you, we have podcasts, we have social media, we have ways where normal people can get the truth out, it is encouraging. And we know people are opening their eyes just every day. I think there's new people that are becoming aware of how they've been spoon-fed bad information, and they're not trusting the old media sources they used to just blindly accept as news. So that has been a beautiful thing that has been happening, and I hope it continues. I know it will. And I hope that just speaking truth to power actually does something and prevents this from happening to another community or watershed. I hope it can prevent that. And I hope maybe somehow it can help alleviate some of the pain that is being felt here in our watershed. And then, like I said, prevent agriculture from someday taking the fall for what's just happened.
Absolutely.
I don't know, I didn't mention this part, but all the sediment that's in the Klamath River now, it needs to be flushed out. But where are they going to get the water to flush it out? They're going to get it from the tributaries, and they're going to tell agriculture, we need every last drop to flush out this sediment.
Wow. Yeah. That's horrifying. And it's shame on the media for not covering this. Truly, you're not the good guys. You are not speaking truth to power. You are doing the powerful's bidding. American Rivers and Gavin Newsom in Sacramento, these are the elite. They have no connection with your community, none whatsoever. They don't care about the tribes. They don't care about your family at all. And the media who are doing their bidding without doing any research whatsoever, talking to you guys, it's just such a blight on the media industry that you and I both had experience in. And I think people just need to understand, these are not the good guys. They are hurting animals. They're hurting ecosystems. They're hurting generations of Americans. They're hurting your food system. You are not going to get a healthier food system when Tyson, Cargill, JBS, Smithfield, Kellogg's, all of these huge companies are the only ones producing your food. That's not going to be a better situation for the environment or for your family or for America. But that's what they're pushing toward by eliminating you guys.
Absolutely.
I think people really need to wake up. And this is not the story from the 70s. This is not like the greenies versus like the big bad, exploiters of the environment. You are the stewards of the environment. You're the little guy. You're the one that is holding what's left of the West and our beautiful natural landscape we inherited from our pioneer ancestors and from the tribes who stewarded it for time immemorial. You are the ones carrying that mantle. You're the one who's blowing the whistle on the true environmental devastation of our time by huge, powerful, deep-pocketed players like American Rivers, like the government in California. I just think people need to get rid of that old narrative and understand what's happening in the real landscape right now.
I know, amazingly, I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'd be good friends with the founders of Greenpeace and some of those when they started. I think that they really stood, or a lot of them stood for something really, really good, and they were corrupted over time. And I don't know if all of them were, but, they probably had a kernel of truth to what they were saying at some point, but it's turned into such a huge money machine that you just can't trust them anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
NGOs. I don't know how they got the word nonprofit put in their name because there's nothing nonprofit about them.
No. So I shared the other day a video from a fisherman from your area, from the Klamath area. And he talked about how the dam removals have destroyed the fishing in the Klamath River and even in the ocean in that part of the state. And I got so many comments from fishermen who were just irate about this video. They just were so angry. They need to believe that the dam removals and restoring a free-flowing river is good for salmon. That's something that people almost on a religious level need to believe in spite of the evidence. But you're telling me the fishermen there, just describe how this has impacted the fishing community, your family, ranchers and fishermen and hunters. We're not in opposition. Most ranchers, most farmers, most people in production ag also fish and hunt. We all want these species to thrive. Nobody is interested in damaging salmon populations. You live there. Of course you want there to be a healthy salmon population. You're saying this damaged salmon populations.
Yeah. Well, I think, if you talk to the independent little fishing guides and those that live on the river and have made their living that way, then they'll tell you what really happened and how bad it was. But there has been kind of a political alignment of some of the fishing groups that have been pro dam removal, kind of anti-agriculture for many years. And same with some of the tribes that, leadership of the tribes. And I should mention too that, just because the titular head of a group, like a chief of a tribe or the head of an organization, a fishing organization, takes one position on something, it doesn't mean that the whole tribe or every fisherman agrees with them. And I think that's something we have to remember. There's plenty of tribal members who didn't agree with this. And there's plenty of fishermen who didn't agree with this, but there has been a political alignment of the organizations, the heads of those organizations that have been pro dam removal and really are going to have a hard time. How do you deal with the fallout now? If you pushed for this, you pushed so hard for this, you wanted it to be a success, you wanted it to look good. And when it didn't turn out good, what are you supposed to do? That's hard.
Right. Oh, I don't think they'll ever be able to admit that. No. You
It
can't
would sure be
acknowledge.
nice if they did, but because that would really help agriculture out so that we don't take, we're not the scapegoat for this, but I just don't, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think they're going to,
I don't
the
think so
narrative
either.
can carry on. It must carry on.
Absolutely. I'm a fly for sure. Men, I love fishing, but it's important to support the people that grow your food, and you don't have to be in conflict with them. Wildlife coexist with animals, like domestic animals. Elk are not apex grazers. They typically like to follow cattle around. There's an
Yeah.
an
Yes.
ecosystem that people need to understand is in existence in nature, and ranchers aren't in opposition to it. It has to be balanced for a growing population. There's a lot of people in California, and we need to have like realistic conversations about this stuff.
Yeah, you're exactly right. But it is true that there is a commercial fishery. The Chinook fishery is a commercial fishery. So there's, real livelihoods made
Yeah,
fishing
totally.
those fish that live in the Klamath, or in the Klamath watershed. And then there's the tribal aspect of the historic fishing, which it was kind of interesting. I was talking to one tribal member who was mad because the government started regulating their, back in, I don't know how long ago, probably when the coho got listed, the government started regulating their ability to do their traditional fishing, take their kids out and fish. And I go, yeah, that's right. So that was the government, the same government that is now pointing the finger at agriculture. They regulated you too. Now they're regulating us. It's not, we shouldn't be pit against each other here. We are the tribal members and the ranchers who have very deep roots. Obviously, tribal members have very deep roots. We are the ones who live on this land and make a living off of this land. And we're not at odds we should not be at odds with each other. We should be at odds with the ones who are telling us that we can't use our waterways, we can't fish our fish, we can't use our ground, to make a living for ourselves. And there has been an effort to pit groups against each other. There's been a concerted effort to cause tribal hatred of farming and ranching in our area. There's been an effort to pit us against the fishing community, which is a false, as you said, that's a false dichotomy. We should not be. We are not the ones to blame for all their woes, and we're not competing for the same resources here. Agriculture uses water, yes, but it's a drop in the bucket for that Klamath watershed. And so, but that's being blown out of proportion by all the coverage of this issue. So it's how much agriculture is using, and then the regulations make it, are almost designed to make it look like, we're going to fix this by regulating agriculture. And they haven't fixed anything by regulating how much water we use. They haven't fixed anything. They just pulled out dams to make the matters worse. If you have a water shortage problem, why would you pull out the dams?
Exactly. No, it's so foolish. I was actually just talking to a guide it was closer to Bishop and Bridgeport in the Sierra Nevadas, and he was saying, and I haven't vetted this, so I don't know if he's right, but he's local, and he was saying that there's like a Chinese-owned farm that grows alfalfa that's drained a bunch of rivers and tributaries in that area. So
Oh,
it is just, those are things that we could talk about. If you're not contributing to the domestic supply, the amount of foreign owned land, those are fair conversations to have. Absolutely. But when you see
yeah.
statistics about domestic agriculture water usage, consider yourself part of that because you're eating that food and that's something that contributes to the country. It's not just farmers and ranchers hoarding water. And also be careful about those statistics because half the time, the numbers they cite for cattle ranching, correct me if I'm wrong here, Theo, you probably know more about this than me, but it'll cite, I think is it green water when it's rainwater or blue water when it's rainwater? They'll include, I think it's blue water as part of the cattle water consumption, which is just rain falling on rangeland, but they cite that as water
Right.
use, so just a lot of manipulation of these
Sure.
things. Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's not an area that I know much about, but I would be interested in, reading what you've been reading. But yeah, I've been thinking this too. Like they talk about us farmers, we're water users. I'm like, wait a minute. You're a water user and you're a water user. You're not only are you drinking water, but you are eating all the stuff that I grow for you. So come on.
Right,
Come on.
right. Yeah, exactly. I know. I mean, if you outsource all your food production to a few people and then you get mad at them for producing your food, let's just think that through, like real quick.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Yeah. Something that I just learned about barbecue last weekend, from some people from Nevada who were ranchers from Orovada by the Oregon border. They were telling me about this giant lithium mine, I'm sure you know about, that is going to be destroying a bunch of sage grouse habitat and the water source for the trout that's supposed to be listed. and the ranchers in that area have been fighting for years. I used to write a lot about the sage grouse regulations that the BLM was doing to ranchers all over the West. You know, you need this much stubble height for the sage grouse to survive and everything, and your cows have to be kicked off at this certain point. Most areas in Nevada don't have stubble height that ever gets this high, you know, like, so this lady was telling me that this lithium mine, though, is getting the go ahead from the BLM to go in, and they're going to lose a bunch of grazing permits from that area. It's going to destroy their water sources. Ranching is just going to take a huge hit. I don't know how many people are going to go out of business with their ranches, but it's okay all of a sudden. It's okay that they're destroying this lithium mine is going to destroy habitat for sage grouse and the trout and draw the aquifer dry because it takes so much water to do whatever their mining process is. I was just so sad to hear that story because, like I said, I kind of traveled around the West for a while back when the sage grouse thing was hot and tried to speak about how ridiculous the regulations were on grazing for sage grouse. It's just so sad to see now that this mine somehow, you know, there's somebody in a position of power is okay with it now, and all that went out the window. I don't know what the story is, who the mine is, or who stands to benefit, but apparently it's very, very rich in lithium in that area. But I'm not against mining, but I just think it's sad that that has to happen, you know. And now it's okay to destroy sage grouse, but cows were the evil,
Right.
but lithium mining is fine.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
What's
I
with
know.
that?
I know. I know. Yeah.
Well, it just makes me wonder if something like that could be going on here. So I'm like, why are you guys doing this? Why, you know, is there some other thing that we're not aware of? You know, some resources that they're after that they just need to get rid of farmers and ranchers first, and then they'll have free reign. Maybe it's all the fresh water. We know we have a good clean water source here. I don't know.
You guys have so much water up there. Every time I go to Northern California, anytime, like even north of Mendo's still pretty dry. There's just so much water in Northern California. It is not, we should not be in a drought. We should not have water cuts. We should have just an overabundance of water. It's insane.
Right.
So yeah, it
Well,
does make you wonder.
sometimes we have a water timing issue. If we had more water
Yes.
storage, you know, we wouldn't have a
Right.
problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
People,
we have abundant water.
right.
Yeah.
Right. We have a very pronounced rainy season, and that's why we need more water storage, which is what Californians voted for over 10 years ago. And
Yeah.
our government hasn't built any significant water storage since we voted for that. So
And
yeah,
ironically, I think that was that bond that was used for some of the money to pull the Klamath dams out.
yes, they did use water, or they used money from money designated by California voters to build water storage to destroy water storage.
Yeah. Go figure.
Go figure. Well, I'm running way over. Do you need to? You probably have kids coming over from school.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I have help.
Okay.
Grandma's dad and everybody. So
Benefits of living close to family. Well, I wanted to ask you really quick if you have a second just about the wolves, because I've been trying to cover this and you're right there in the middle of it. Do you guys, it seems like this year it hit critical mass with the wolf problem.
yeah, I think it's getting pretty bad. Luckily they're not right where my cows are yet. I'm afraid it's coming. But where my brother and sister-in-law put the care on some cows over in Shasta Valley, they're having problems over there. And I have gone to some brandings at some neighbors of theirs on a little place where I don't think I'm going to go back again to another branding there because it was so heartbreaking. Like the number of calves that were crippled and had missing ears and hamstrung and just are totally stressed out and just
Ugh,
yeah.
heartbreaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm sure that's affecting their pregnancy rates. And,
Yeah.
cows aren't going to breed up in conditions like that when they're that stressed out.
Right.
So, and the
they're
government,
They become dangerous all of a sudden. The cows are terrified of your dogs, or they're on the
the
fight
cows have
all the
become
time.
dangerous. Okay.
Yeah. So that changes things for everyone. Like, you know, if you can't trust it, you can't, and then you don't know when you're going to run into wolves either. I mean, I don't know. They're very bold. Those wolves have killed, have you seen the pictures of the elk that was killed on some lady's doorstep? There's blood on her door.
Is that your county, Siskiyou? I talked to or was
I
that
don't know if that was,
Shasta?
I think
I
that
talked to the
might have been,
sheriff there, Mike Fisher, I think his name is.
yeah, that might have been in Shasta County. I'm
Yeah,
not
right on
100%.
someone's doorstep.
Yeah.
Insane. In the
But then
neighborhood.
the pictures you see of calves laying there, they're still alive, but their rear ends are eaten out. Or, there was a heifer who was, attacked while she was trying to calve. It's just, it's so awful because these are the animals that we're here to protect. Like, we are in charge of them. We care for them. They rely on us for their care. And we're allowing this to happen to them. And we can't do anything about it. The state, if you do anything to harass a wolf, it's illegal. So the most you can do is put up flattery, like little ribbons to try to scare them away. But if they'll come and kill an elk on your front doorstep, then I don't think the ribbons tied on your fence are going to do anything. And you can't even fire a shot. I mean,
You cannot kill a wolf, that's even if they're in the middle of killing your dog or your cow.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Um,
So you have no
yeah,
protection.
you'll have to talk to somebody who's more of an expert on it. But I know that our hands are tied.
I just saw this morning Joe Rogan posted a very disturbing photo on Instagram of a calf, killed from the hind end, eaten.
He did?
Yes, he did, from Colorado. Yeah, and it was just a classic like wolf kill from the back end up, this little calf. And he said it was from his friend who has a ranch in Colorado, and he just condemned ballot box biology and was pretty outspoken about it. And I never comment on, I know it was good. I never comment on stuff like that, but I did. And the responses are just so typical. But a lot of people told me, wolves don't hunt like that. Actually, you're wrong. They don't hunt in that way where they eat from the legs up or hamstring them and eat them from the back end, or they only eat a small amount of meat from each animal and they wipe out, which is what I was describing. Because
I've the sick and the weak. Right.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So I don't know what biologists say. I just know the ranchers I've talked to and the elk hunting guys I've talked to have described what they've seen, which is wolves hunt for sport. They don't eat the whole animal. They sometimes will eat 5 pounds from each animal, leave the animal to die in a lot of agony. And it's really, really awful and cruel. I hate to even talk about it. Mothers giving birth, babies, again, from the back up in the most cruel way you can imagine. That's what ranchers and people who spend time outside say. So I don't care what biologists say. Right. That's what people who are dealing with this have seen, and it's horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I talked to, I think, a neighbor of yours in Siskiyou, but he was telling me he's spoken to pioneer families who've been there for a long, long time. Native families, you read all the records of California. Spanish were here in California for a long time. You don't read about these huge packs of wolves. You'll read about maybe a lone wolf here or there. But this isn't native to California, is my understanding. Have you heard anything about this?
Well, that's my understanding too. And when I was in DC working for the livestock industry, I remember working with some people who were telling me that the wolves that were originally introduced into Yellowstone were not native to this part, to our country. They were Canadian timber wolves. So they were not the same predator. They were a much larger predator than what would have been here originally. So, and we know that the Mexican wolf down on the border down there is a way smaller little wolf, way different deal. Not that they don't have their problems down there too with them, but these wolves we're talking about are massive. And I don't think there's any historic account of wolves like that here. They just introduced them anyway. They call it reintroduction, but I don't think I think this is new. And how is our ecosystem going to respond to that? Not just our businesses, but how we've been trying to protect our deer herd for decades because it struggles because they protected the mountain lion, which are everywhere. but they're still protected. And bears, which are everywhere, I don't think they're protected, but you still have to have a permit to shoot one. So the deer around here are struggling. And with a wolf introduced, I just don't see how they can survive that. And then their only food source will be my cattle.
Yeah. And are you worried about human interaction at some point?
Well, yeah, I am, because these wolves are very bold and not, I think they're accustomed to humans. I think, I don't know why, but maybe some of them were raised in captivity. I don't know. Some of them act like that.
Well, we didn't vote for them in California. Colorado voted to release wolves, and we know where they got them. We know what
Hmm.
states they got them from, and a lot of them are colored. But what
Hmm.
you're saying, what you're referencing, California didn't vote for them. Some, I'm sure, migrated, but I have heard people asking questions about where some of these wolves came from. Some of them don't act like normal wild animals. They are way too comfortable around humans. I've heard
Hmm.
stories about cages in the woods and these weird things like that. Have you heard that kind of thing? Do your neighbors talk about
Yeah.
that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there's weird vehicles around that, yeah, I'm pretty sure that they've been planted, but, it's all anecdotal. There's no official story there. So it's hard to back it up. But when you live there and you see it happening, then yeah, we are all fairly certain that that's what's happening, not just natural migration.
Oh, well, Theo, I've talked to you for almost 2 hours. You're just so knowledgeable. I'm really thankful for all your time. Thank you for spending time talking
Thank you.
about this and all your
Yeah, thanks
research.
for encouraging me.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Gosh, just been awesome.
Fun stories to talk about. I mean, this is heavy. And I don't know, it's hard to write about. It's hard to write about
Yeah,
this stuff. I'm sure it is for you too. It's your hometown. It's
yeah,
personal. You feel like you're fighting the whole machine because, I
yeah,
mean, it's like this is not the popular narrative. What we're saying here and what we're talking about, you're not going to hear this in a lot of places. So it can be
right.
lonely. I'm very thankful for all your hard work. Truly, this article is very powerful, super knowledgeable. Um, can people find you anywhere? Is there anything that you can share? Are you online or writing anywhere publicly right now?
Um, Not a lot. I'm mostly doing the ranch and mom stuff, but I have some content on scottvalleyagua.org where we talk about what's happening with our fake emergency drought here locally, but
What's that website? Scott Valley.
Scott Valley Agua, AGWA.org.
Okay, great.
Mhm. Just kind of trying to keep everybody up to speed on what's happening here with the state and what they're doing with the emergency regulation here. And um, we started a grassroots group a couple years ago when this popped up. But I fought really hard on that for a couple of years and gave it lots and lots of my time and energy and didn't see a huge improvement from that. Trying to speak truth to power about what's really going on with our salmon populations in our watershed and how the water cuts weren't helping and everything. And it just, when you don't see your actions having a lot of fruit, bearing any fruit, then you kind of just, you can't keep that kind of energy going in that direction.
Yeah.
So I have backed away from that some just because it hasn't seemed to make a difference, sadly. But you never know. Things could have gotten worse than they did, I suppose. So we'll
Yeah,
keep
and if
trying.
it wasn't for you talking about this, I wouldn't know about it, and people watching this wouldn't know. And I think you have reality on your side, and I just think someday my future kids, your kids, they'll look back and know you did your best, and you did it for them. You're doing it for the next
Gosh,
generation and
yeah,
whatever
we're doing what
conditions
we
they're going to
can, huh?
face. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, that's exactly right. Just, just do our best here in California. I hope Doug
Yeah,
Burgum listens to you and yeah, this is
me
really
too.
important to get the truth out there because this is not the last dam removal they have planned. Neither is the one in Mendocino. This is going to be an issue
Right.
across the West. California is a very easy testing ground. So this
Yep.
is a huge story. And you're a whistleblower for it. You do have, it seems, a good representative in Doug LaMalfa. He's still beating that drum. I saw the other day a video
Mm-hmm.
on the House floor of him talking about Klamath and talking about dam removals. From my interactions with him, he seems like someone who has been a good representative for
Yeah, he has been.
Siskiyou.
And he fought really hard And, Congress rejected the proposal to take the dams out once, but then they just circumvented Congress the
How
next,
did they do
to
that?
make.
Did they just through an agency, through FERC or something?
Yeah, through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So what they did was they created a shell corporation called the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. We call it a shell corporation because it was created out of thin air just to be an entity to take on the dam licensure from PacifiCorp so they could transfer the licensure to Klamath River Renewal Corporation and then decommission the dams after that. And then when the project was over, this corporation was to just kind of disappear and dissolve, this is what had everybody super worried around here because we knew there was going to be a ton of fallout from people with damaged homes and, whatever else road damage, other things that could happen because of dam removal, and that this entity would just disappear. So, there'd be nobody left liable. And this is why FERC didn't allow at first. They said, no, you can't take on the liability of this hugely risky project. And then that's when Oregon and California both stepped in and said, well, we'll join in with
they'll
the
cover
Klamath
that extra
River
liability that you were saying. Oh, wow.
So FERC finally was satisfied that somebody would be there to cover the liability of this massive experimental, disastrous project. But it's hard to believe that California is going to pay anybody who was harmed by this. They've pretty much ignored everything else that we've brought up to them. So,
right. Yeah, I can't get over them. You voted against dam removal. 79% voted no. That was ignored. Congress rejected a proposal to remove the dams. That was ignored. That was circumvented. Then you were forced to pay to destroy your own dams, your own watershed, your own ecosystem, your own fisheries. Now you're suffering the consequences and no one is accountable. That's really the story of the Klamath Dam so far, and it's ongoing.
You got it.
Well, thank you, Theo. You're one of the few people really getting information out about this, and I'm super thankful, and everyone should be, because this is not isolated to the Klamath River Basin. Dam removals are planned across the West. It's going to destroy more watersheds, more communities, more ag communities, more agriculture, more fisheries. So this story is the canary in the coal mine. It's extremely important. The whole country needs to pay attention to this and stop it. We stop destroying our own infrastructure, our own way of life, our own livelihood. For what? We know it's not for the salmon. We know that now. So what's it for?
Yep.
You can read more of Theo's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Theo, please.
Thank you so much for your coverage of it and all your efforts to protect, the small agricultural producers in this country. Because like you said, that's our foundation of our freedom. So we can't let it go. So thank you.
Of course. You can read more of Theo's writing, scottvalleyagwa.org. Again, this article she wrote is phenomenal. It's a very, very important piece right now that everyone needs to read and pay attention to. I embedded those videos you talk about with Dr. Hauser so you can watch him blowing the whistle on this. You just have sighting after sighting of the facts and the data. You have photos. This is really important. So thank you so much, Theo. Anything else to add before I stop taking up your whole day and let you get back to your kids?
No, I just really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.